Hey y'all. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ro Kelly. I am a bookseller here at Left Bank, and I, along with our whole team, welcome you to Left Bank Books and to this special evening. Tonight, we welcome Khameer Kidia, who will discuss his latest book, Empire of Madness, Reimagining Western Mental Health Care for Everyone. And to keep the conversation going, we also welcome Maxie Glamour as our conversation partner tonight. And some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is made possible because of your support. So when you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into your local economy, and it also helps writers get the support that they need by letting us produce events like this. So thank you all for shopping local, and thank you for being here tonight. We also try to get events in the community for all kinds of readers. So on Monday, we are partnering with the St. Louis County Library to welcome award-winning author Tayari Jones to discuss her unforgettable new novel, Kin, which is about two Black women's lifelong friendship, sisterhood, adversity, and more. And on Thursday the 19th, we will be at COCA for the ticket event with one of our favorite authors, Lindy West, and her debut new memoir, Adult Braces, Driving Myself Sane, which is about an uproarious cross-country road trip that she reinvents her marriage and herself in the process. So if either of those sound compelling to you, please join us at those off-site events. And if neither sound compelling, we have so many more on our website, so please check them out. But for tonight's event, we are excited to welcome Khameer Kidia, who will discuss his latest book. And if you don't know, he is a writer, a physician, and anthropologist, and has worked at the Harvard Medical School and the University of Zimbabwe, and has worked on global mental health for the last decade. Rethinking the system using a global approach. He has written what Vikram Patel has called a must-read for anyone interested in a refreshing, even radical perspective on mental health. And again, to keep the convo flowing, Maxie Glamour is an anti-fascist fairy creature studying philosophy, making music, and toppling gender norms with wit, whimsy, and grace. Maxie is also the third board committee person, a commissioner of the Civil Rights Enforcement Agency in St. Louis, an award-winning multimedia artist that delivers their own brand of arts and entertainment. So thank you for listening to me for so long while you're all actually here. Tonight, we are going to welcome again Khameer Kidia and Maxie Glamour.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Left Bank Books for putting this event on. I feel so honored to be here. And thank you to you as an audience to be here on a Friday night. Wow, I feel very honored to be in conversation on a Friday night with folks. So that's very exciting for me. Maxie, thank you for being in conversation. I'm so excited for our conversation. And there are two people in the audience that I really wanted to shout out. The first is Ashton Bodie, who is my research assistant on this book. Ash and I have just had so many engaging conversations about mental health and about colonialism and about queer theory. This book wouldn't be what it is without her. And so I'm so grateful, Ashton, for everything that you put into this. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. And then a lot of folks have asked why I'm in St. Louis. And the reason is because of my wonderful friendship with Professor Rachel Brown at WashU, who got tenure today. This is an intellectual conversation that we have been having for many, many years. And Rachel was there to kind of talk through the beginning bits of the book and talk through drafts of it. Again, it wouldn't be the book that it is today without her help. And so thank you so much for bringing me here, Rachel, and for helping to organize all of this. I love you. So this is a book about reimagining the way we approach mental health problems in the West, where as a physician, I've been taught to send my patients to therapy and prescribe their medications. And I've seen that for a lot of folks, especially as an anthropologist working both here and in the Global South, for a lot of folks who are living in poverty, under conditions of racism and classism and sexism, therapy and meds aren't always enough. And so here, what I'm doing is I'm calling for a shift in the way we think about mental health care towards something that's more structural, towards something that's more collective, and that thinks about care as something that isn't just what we do in the clinic and the hospital, but also as something that we do outside of medical institutions through care that is social and political. And what that looks like, it's really context dependent. So this is a book with a lot of ideas about what radical mental health care can look like. And it's supposed to jog something for the reader and make you think about where you are in the world and your positionality. Historically speaking, madness has always existed, and the dominant understanding for the way that we approach it has changed from something spiritual to something biological to something psychoanalytic. And so what I'm calling for here is something social and political, a shift away from those things, because really it's all of those things. And what has changed over time is just the dominant hypothesis for what we think is the biggest contributor. And I think that the social and political is really important, because if we can convince doctors in the medical field that this is the way we should be thinking about things, I think it could change a lot for what we are able to do for patients. Because, in the last 30 years or so, all of the research that we have in mental health hasn't really changed the way that we treat these conditions, including the genetic research. Mental health is seen as a polygenic thing. And so it's very hard to find like a targeted genetic treatment for it. And so our genes that we have are really our genes that we have, and you can't change them. But what you can change are our social and political conditions. And I think that argument needs to come back into the medical field. And that's why, as a doctor, I want to bring these conversations that cross disciplines and that cross the borders of like where doctors are talking and where policymakers are talking as well. And how I make this argument. So this argument is complex and difficult to make in a linear way. I tried doing it that way. I tried writing the book in a really kind of linear, sort of stepwise manner, and it didn't work. So in the process of sort of putting everything together, I thought a lot about, as a mental health researcher, as an anthropologist, and as a clinician, what were the things in my own life, what events happened to me that changed the way that I have come to think about mental health problems. And then I started to write about and around those events and those ideas. And as I wrote about those events and ideas, my thinking on mental health changed as well, and it evolved. And so what you have here is sort of the product of a snapshot in time of my thinking and the thinking of a lot of other really, really smart people whose ideas I've kind of encapsulated and then threaded through a narrative of that story of my own personal evolution. So basically there's this story of me sort of figuring it out as a patient, figuring it out as a doctor, figuring it out as a mental health researcher. But interspersed through this story is this argument that I make in two parts. So the two-part argument is firstly to deconstruct a biomedical understanding of the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness from within a medical sort of purview or remit. Because what I feel is that if we can, deconstruct something from within medicine, we might be able to get more folks on board than attacking medicine from the outside, which is something that is doctors feel quite threatened by a lot of the ideas from social theory and from the social sciences that are thinking about some of these things. And I felt if I could say things in a way that doctors would understand, and if I could get them on board, that would help to get the public on board too. So the first is that deconstruction piece of the argument. And one of the main ways that I make that is by using schizophrenia as a constant case study throughout the book. And the reason I do that is because we can also get behind the idea that depression and anxiety are, these social conditions that are, affected by the things that are happening in our social political lives. But schizophrenia, now that's the genetic one, right? That's the really biological condition. And even my editor was like, are you sure you want to be saying these things about schizophrenia? And I am convinced enough about the data around schizophrenia to convey it and to kind of trust it. And we might be able to talk a little bit about what some of that data looks like later, Maxie. But there's pretty convincing data to show that our social conditions shape both the severity and the prevalence of schizophrenia. For example, when Afro-Caribbeans migrate from the Caribbean to the UK, they develop a 15 times increased risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia compared to the general population in the UK. And nothing really can explain that. Genetics can't explain that because back home in the Caribbean, the rates of schizophrenia remain low. And you can talk a little bit about clinician bias, but even clinician bias due to racism can't explain a 15 times increase in the rate at which people are diagnosed with schizophrenia when they change conditions. And what is happening is, they're moving to the UK where capitalism is more cutthroat, where productivity is a virtue, where families are more isolated and atomized and nuclear. And so it's those change of conditions that are really responsible for that kind of shaping of the disorder of schizophrenia. And I think that, when you start to make these arguments about schizophrenia itself, it really turns the paradigm on its head for a lot of people, as it did for me. When I first encountered the data about schizophrenia, I was shocked. I felt existentially unmoored because so much of my training had been teaching me otherwise. And it's not as if this data goes against what the biomedical hypotheses for schizophrenia say, but it does help fill out the picture of why we're struggling to fully understand this illness with only a biological lens. It's because it's not just a biological thing, it's very much also a social, cultural, and political thing. So that's the first part of the argument, deconstructing the biomedical paradigm for thinking about mental illness from within. And then the second part is to offer an exercise in the imagination, because a real problem that we have at the moment, both in medicine and in the world at large, is just that we lack imagination, and that's part of what capitalism does. It narrows the way that you think about the world. I think it's Zizek and Mark Fisher who say something like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And for me, what giving readers lots of little examples of radical ways of reimagining mental health does is reminding people that there are other ways of doing things, that we can learn from other cultures, from other disciplines, from indigenous knowledge, from people all around the world who are experiencing and tackling mental distress in ways that are outside of a Western capitalist healthcare system. And we can learn from those things, and we can be inspired by those things. And that's sort of where I want readers to end off with this book, is just with a feeling of inspiration, to feel as though you can go back into your own worlds with some kind of oomph to your approach, and to think about the world in a way that is a little bit outside of the boxes that we've been given. So that's how I make the argument. A lot of the book is about my encounters with these issues in my own research and in my clinical practice. And a lot of doctor books that I had read before I wrote this book were very focused on the clinical wins that we have in medicine. When I think of Oliver Sacks, for example, a lot of that type of doctor writing is how we solved the big mysterious case that no one else could. And those tales used to be very exciting to me as a doctor in training. But when I started to write about my patients, I felt very uncomfortable about sharing those types of stories. And what I realized was in order for me to convey what I learned and how I learned, I was often turning to the stories where I had failed as a clinician, as a doctor, as a patient advocate. And so a lot of the book is kind of these stories of me failing but learning and growing in the process. And I wanted to do a short reading that comes from a chapter that is about a period near the beginning of the pandemic when doctors all over the world were extremely stressed out because, we knew nothing about this new disease and it was killing people all over. And we were living in a world of great uncertainty. Rates of mental illness were extremely high. People were very anxious. And as doctors, we were also extremely anxious. And some Zimbabwean doctors approached me because I had been working in mental health in Zimbabwe for quite some time. And they were like, I hear you work in mental health in Zimbabwe. Can you help us with our mental health? And it seemed like the perfect way of engaging with, what I had been doing as a clinician in the US and the research that I'd been doing as an anthropologist in Zimbabwe. And so, I started working on this peer support group with Zimbabwean doctors, and we met on a weekly basis, and they seemed to really get a lot out of it, and I was getting a lot out of it. We were all sharing our concerns. It was really eye-opening for a lot of people and heartening for me. But at some point, there was this, a different variant of the virus, and death rates started getting worse. And so folks were like, this is really bad. We need more than this. And so they asked if I would maybe lead something like a trauma debriefing workshop. And I thought about it, and I wanted to figure out how to do it. And this passage is the result of that thinking. In early 2021, the South African variant swept through Zimbabwe, and COVID death rates soared. Multiple doctors died, including a close mentor. I flew home to see if I could help. I was 6 months post-residency as a newly qualified internist and one of the only vaccinated Zimbabweans in the world. The group is really struggling, wrote one of the senior organizers in a WhatsApp message. Is there something we can do? When a patient of mine dies, I conduct a formal debriefing. I gather the team and we sit in a quiet place to honor the life lost. We discuss the case, make space for emotion, grieve. Maybe I can do a workshop on trauma debriefing, I wrote back. I set out to make the trauma debriefing workshop rich and constructive. I started with the model used in our hospital in Boston. Pause, prepare, analyze, understand, sentiment, educate. While searching the literature, I found a name for this type of technique, critical incident stress debriefing. It was pioneered in 1983 by Jeffrey Mitchell, a paramedic and firefighter turned trauma specialist. I was impressed by the simplicity of the approach. A short, structured conversation performed within 72 hours of the traumatic event. Then I stumbled upon a paper in The Lancet that aggregated data from 29 studies on trauma debriefing. It found that not only did critical incident stress debriefing not improve the natural recovery from psychological trauma, but it actually fared worse than other trauma interventions. I paused in shock. What? Nervous about the now questionable evidence substantiating the benefits of my workshop, but emboldened by hubris nonetheless, I went ahead and scheduled the workshop. Although I was in Zimbabwe at this point, I used Zoom so that doctors working in all parts of the country, including rural communities, could log on. One doctor, a woman in her late 20s, shared her story of losing a colleague to suicide during the pandemic. We role-played debriefing the scenario as though we had all experienced the trauma. I had one doctor pretend to lead the debriefing, and I fed him phrases he could use to help us discuss the event. How was this for everyone? What part of this felt difficult or emotionally challenging? What went well? What is one takeaway from the situation? The conversation became stilted. People started dropping off Zoom. 12, 8, 7, 4. Eventually there were only 2 left, including the doctor whose case we were debriefing. I forged ahead, convinced I was still helping. I closed the workshop with a plot twist. We would debrief the debriefing workshop, a meta debriefing. So, I said to the 2 remaining Zoom participants who, by this point, had turned off their cameras. How was this for everyone? Silence. I stared patiently into the black rectangles, knowing that for Zimbabweans, this silence could be a natural pause. But the rectangles felt emptier than usual. That's when I realized I was alone, and had been for quite a while. I tried one last hello, and then clicked End Meeting for all.
That was kind of sad.
It was kind of sad. I remember feeling very dejected at the time. I was like, oh my goodness, what have they done?
So one thing that I was just kind of thinking about was in the text, you're really looking at, COVID is a big phenomenon that we can't escape, none of us still today. And you spoke about how in like the West, in America, we put a new attention to the mental health of the care providers, and how in Zimbabwe and other places in the world that attention isn't there. Can you kind of tell me when that epiphany showed up and how, in this Zoom meeting, that kind of manifested?
Yeah, I think for us in the US, we had this like healthcare worker hero sort of rhetoric, banging pots and pans outside of our doors. And I remember feeling kind of like a hero too, I was like, this is kind of dangerous, and I'm still doing it. I had no choice. It was scary too, but it was also a way of coping, thinking of myself in these like heroic terms was definitely gave me the, emboldened me to carry on doing what I was doing. What I realized when I started to speak to Zimbabwean folks who were struggling was that they were having a completely different experience. We were having folks send stuff to the hospital for us. We got all of this takeout that would just arrive at lunchtime because restaurants were like trying to feed all the healthcare workers, and we were getting like pens emblazoned with the hospital logo on it. And Sarah Jessica Parker came on Zoom and was congratulating us and thanking us for what we were doing. Yo Ma played the cello on Zoom for us. He was like, thank you for all your hard work. But when I spoke to Zimbabweans about it, this was all they had. All they had was this Zoom workshop that I was doing with them on a weekly basis. And they were going through all the same things that we were going through, but they had none of the resources that we had. In a lot of places, they didn't even have running water. Imagine running a clinic without clean water during a pandemic. And so what I realized was, these big differences in the way COVID was spread across the world. But what it also did for me at the time was, when we had this failed trauma workshop, I asked for some feedback, and I was sort of like, well, what do you think went on here? Why wasn't this helpful? And the feedback that I got from the doctors in the workshop was that this just wouldn't work in a place like Zimbabwe. And I asked why. And they said, well, this thing that you keep talking about, trauma, in Zimbabwe, we've been experiencing trauma for centuries, starting with colonialism and then, moving on to like terrible political violence and HIV/AIDS pandemic and malaria and cholera, and just insult after insult, what you could perhaps call chronic trauma, but which, chronic trauma doesn't even get to the real material realities of what Zimbabweans were experiencing on a day-to-day basis. What they were experiencing was a chronic burning trauma dumpster fire. And so, a little pandemic on top of that for them felt like this was just par for the course. And they couldn't really understand why we were making so much of what was going on in other parts of the world. And so, these differences between how health is kind of distributed across the world is something that I have found to be a way of thinking through a lot of these problems. I'll go to Zimbabwe and I will speak to folks and be engaged in that system, and then I will come here and work as a doctor and speak to folks and be engaged in this system. And the comparative life expectancies and the comparative statistics on all of this stuff really helps me to think through a lot of these problems on a kind of a global scale. So I don't know if that answers your question, Maxie, but it's a lot to do with what COVID laid bare for folks.
I think it raises more questions, actually.
Go for it.
That's why we're here. I'm just thinking about, the nomenclature of trauma, right? In the text, you do mention about PTSD being something that's attributed to people in the military or people that it's like it's a classification, but you know, we can imagine people living in Zimbabwe or Palestine, that post component isn't really an occurrence, it's just this constant trauma. And so how is the like linguistic differences a way that constructs the way that we are approaching healthcare, especially with trauma?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think what you're pointing at is trauma has this very kind of script around it. It has this narrative like bad thing happens, then you work through it and you recover and you get better. And for people who are being constantly insulted by traumatic or like material circumstances that affect them throughout their lives, they never have a chance to escape from that event and then have the kind of retrospective look at trauma in a way that allows them to make meaning. Trauma is something that in like a Western construct is thought of as this linear thing: trauma and then recovery. That's what Judith Herman's book is called. A famous traumatologist. And there is no recovery for people who are living under constant violence, who are living under structural violence in Palestine, in Zimbabwe. And so not having the privilege to take a step back and look at your trauma is their reality. And that is something that is hard to contend with, because trauma as a linguistic thing cannot really account for chronic poverty. It cannot really account for chronic violence. But it is a way of talking about hardship that in the West we are so accustomed to. And in part that comes from the way that trauma has been constructed around the benefits of being a victim. So, along with the kind of the label of trauma comes this idea of victimhood, where if something bad has happened to you, you get something in return, or you are able to, for example, access disability benefits if you get a diagnosis of PTSD, or people feel sorry for you, and you get empathetic support from folks. That kind of political and social power does not exist with psychiatry in a lot of other parts of the world. The same thing goes for diagnoses like gender dysphoria, and diagnoses that help people access resources like gender affirming care. A diagnosis of gender dysphoria for someone in Zimbabwe, for a queer person in Zimbabwe, is not helpful. It doesn't have that same political power. And so, when we think about what psychiatry is doing around the world, if it's giving you just some words to describe, what you're feeling, but no solution to what is going on, that's a real problem.
And so I see the same parallels with psychiatry as I do with trauma, right? You can go to therapy. You can go to therapy 7 times a week, but that is not going to ameliorate your material conditions. It's not going to decolonize the situation. It's not going to get Wesley Bell out of office. And so we can see that the political system, the sociological components, their causal links to this trauma, and you talk about psychiatry, I say it wrong, and how it sometimes is this facade, right? It's not really doing anything. Like you said, it's just like words, like Jungian archetypes, and like Freudian psychoanalysis it's not going to help me from living under oppression. And so kind of, how can we reshift our perspective around that to ensure that we're actually implementing psychiatric help and people are actually helped as opposed to quelled?
Yeah, I don't think psychiatry is useless. I am someone who benefits from psychiatry. I take psychiatric medications, and I've been in therapy, and I prescribe them for my patients and send my own patients to therapy, because we still got to cope, right, with what's going on right now. And what psychiatry does sometimes offer are ways of coping and ways of relieving the symptoms. But really what the research around mental health shows is that our mental health doesn't come from just the chemicals floating around in our brains. It comes from the way that our brains interact with our social-political environment and the impact of that social-political environment on our brains itself. So we've got the paradigm the wrong way around in psychiatry. We're thinking of the cause as somewhere in the neurochemistry of people's brains. Sure, there are chemicals involved, but there are chemicals involved right now in the conversation that we're having and in the emotions that we're feeling here at the moment. But the chemicals are not the source of the problem. The source of the problem is external, and what we really need to be doing is changing that paradigm, because we can do something about the external. We can actually shape our social political lives to make them better. And so, in the book, I think about it at every sort of level, but at the grandest level, I'm thinking about reparations and debt cancellation. I'm thinking about what are things that we can do to make the world a fairer, more just place. A world where psychiatry eventually becomes obsolete, right? That's abolitionary thinking, is to think about how we can make a field like psychiatry someday obsolete. That might not happen in any of our lifetimes, but if we don't have that as the hopeful end game, then we're sort of missing the forest for the trees. And we're also giving, society and medicine the permission to perpetuate the status quo and not make the important socio-political changes. So that's like another big problem that I have with like a medical approach to mental health, is that because medicine has such a dominant hold on how we understand these issues and on how the public understands these issues, what we end up messaging to the public is that the solution to these issues is in that pill. So what I really want from a most kind of basic, essential level with my fellow clinician colleagues is to have a much more honest argument about what we're doing here. To really be honest with ourselves and with our patients about what psychiatric medications are and how they work in people's brains. Psychiatric medications, pretty much all of them, are what are called pleiotropic. In other words, they were not designed specifically to treat brain disorders in people's brains. In fact, they were reverse engineered and tested the other way around for lots of different conditions. Most psychiatric drugs were tested as painkillers. They were tested to try and increase lactation in cows. And we use antipsychotics, the drugs that we think of as like the drugs for schizophrenia, all the time in the hospital to treat nausea, hiccups, insomnia, anxiety, even though we think of these drugs as actually the schizophrenia and bipolar, mainstays. The majority of prescriptions from these drugs aren't even for schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, which shows you how they have they have all of these effects. But when we talk to a patient, we give them the impression that this is a drug that is curing a thing in their brain. And we know it's not true. We know from going to medical school and learning about how these drugs work when we study pharmacology. But somewhere along the line, we've been taught to flatten that complexity for our patients, and I'm not sure what the reason is. I think it's a type of condescension, really. It's like an assumption that our patients are too stupid to understand the complexity of this, when that couldn't be further from the truth. What they want is an honest accounting of what is going on, and that's what I want to be offering my patients.
Next time I'm taking a whole bunch of Adderall, finishing an essay, I'm going to think, was this made to help a cow lactate? If it wasn't, I'll never do it again. I want to bring back to, this pathologization component of it. We see psychiatry as, trying to fix somebody, right? Trying to ensure that an individual can coalesce and conform to particular mental, normalities. And so how do we, as community members who are neurodiverse or neurotypical, recognize the pathologization, but also the sociological change that needs to happen to ensure that we're validating the people who have neurocomplex ways of thinking?
I think pathologization is like a really really big problem. In part because, our hope with telling people that they have brain diseases, our hope there is that we would de-pathologize things, that we would destigmatize mental illness. That's sort of what psychiatrists keep saying. Is like, oh, don't worry, this is just a problem in your brain. But that's kind of a hard thing to deal with because it is your brain after all, and so it does kind of feel like it's your fault. And so changing that narrative is complicated. But I want to talk about an intervention that I've worked on in Zimbabwe that kind of thinks about that in a more careful way, and it's called the friendship bench. So a psychiatrist in Zimbabwe called Dixon Chibanda, a brilliant guy, friend of mine, was thinking about ways to help Zimbabweans with really skyrocketing rates of mental illness in the mid-2000s when there was a lot of political violence going on, a lot of hyperinflation, and the economy was really bad. The rates of common mental disorders were in the 30% range, which is really, really high. And what he did was meet with some grandmothers, many of them illiterate, and ask them how they would approach these problems. And they created an intervention that used local idioms for understanding mental distress. In Zimbabwe, folks don't say, I'm depressed or I'm anxious. They say, kufungisisa, I'm thinking too much. And that by itself is not a pathological framing, you're just thinking too much. And so, within their cultural idioms, they designed an intervention with wooden benches outside of clinics in urban Harare, where a grandmother would sit with a patient and deliver 6 basic sessions of sort of problem-solving cognitive behavioral therapy, but what was more just kind of like sitting with your grandma and like chatting. And they did a massive randomized control trial and compared these grandmothers on these benches to usual medical care, including antidepressants. And the trial showed that the grandmothers were better than antidepressants and usual medical care. It was such an amazing trial that it got published in JAMA, which is the Journal of American Medical Association, one of the top medical journals in the world. And that data shows you that depathologizing these things, talking about these things out in the open where everyone can see them, within the cultural, non-pathological idioms of Zimbabwean people that were familiar to them, that these were more liberating and more effective ways. Even if we wanted to use the scientific method to measure that effectiveness, they were even more effective ways of demonstrating these things. So that's like an example of like a radical mental health intervention that I think we need to be creating the conditions for, so that communities all around the world can come up with their own ideas. The idea is not like to copy the friendship bench and do it all over the world, although now they're doing that. There are friendship benches in New York City and there are friendship benches in Washington, D.C. And I'm of two minds of that, because my thought is, well, let's ask the people in Washington, D.C. what they want and like figure out like what meets the needs of their community. And so that's why, I think the depathologization stuff is important, but the way to depathologize is to go to the community themselves and figure out like, what are non-pathological framings for you?
And then, there's sparks of like cultural appropriation, right? Everything from like quinoa to shamanism is something that Lululemon girls are like monthly obsessed with. And so when we can see, Western civilizations, white people, I think is a more appropriate term, finding, a way to admire the noble savage, to admire the primitiveness of living outside of modernity and going back to this anachronistic way of outside of medicine. And so we can see that same rhetoric being charging anti-vaxxers, charging people putting essential oils in their ears, and really, I don't want to say ludicrous things, but someone else in the audience could. And so where are the parameters of appreciating non-Western approaches and them just being co-opted and watered down?
Yeah, co-optation is a real problem. And this is the question that keeps me awake at night, Maxie. I worry about this all the time, about the over-romanticization of rural living and of indigenous knowledge, because people are still suffering. And what I always go back to is the material realities of their lives. Because I think when you think about those things, forget the cultural sort of understandings of mental illness and all of that. When we go to the structural stuff and we think about poverty itself, that's where the real work from the West needs to be coming. Let communities come up with their own interventions for themselves. But the responsibility in the West isn't to be doing those interventions. That's the responsibility of those communities. The responsibility in the West is to redistribute resources, rights, and privileges in a fairer way for the rest of the world, so that other communities can come up with their own unique interventions that are culturally appropriate for themselves. So white people, your job isn't really to run the friendship bench, but it is to be fighting for the kinds of structural change like reparations and debt cancellation that make the world a place where those things could come up in the first place. And so I think Olufemi Taiwo, who talks about reparations in a really thoughtful way and sets them in this idea of the global racial empire, really helped me think through who holds what kind of responsibility for what kind of change. And I think the type of responsibility that the West holds for this kind of change are these structural changes that actually do have to hurt a little bit. Good reparations sort of actually do have to hurt a little bit. Zimbabwean people and, in African culture, when we think about this idea of Ubuntu, which is this idea of collectivity, and it directly translates to I am because we are, and is a way that a lot of African philosophy is kind of ontologically centered. When folks think about Ubuntu, they don't just think of it as in a forgiveness thing. So in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of South Africa, Desmond Tutu used this idea of Ubuntu to sort of forgive what had happened in apartheid. But there was no material demands made with that forgiveness. But what African people actually say is "Nikolisa ngani," which means, with what are you apologizing? You have to give something up as an act of your contrition. Panashia Chibumatsi is the scholar who says this. You have to give something up as an act of your contrition to show that these really are forgiveness and reparations. And so that is really the responsibility for the West, is how to redistribute this stuff. And Taiwo also says that that's where the responsibility lies.
I love that. I want to kind of pivot and talk about the gays. I've heard that's why you made your book so vibrant, because you're part of the family. And so I always think about gay people. I think we kind of have to in Missouri, when we're the most homophobic state in the country.
Really, I didn't know that.
We're neck and neck with Texas. Depends on the year. It's just March, so we got to see how many transphobic bills they'll put in. They're banning us from bathrooms this month. So last year was public spaces in general. But these are causally linked to the negative psychological implications of queer people, right? We not only over-medicate ourselves, we see higher rates of suicide, higher rates of PTSD, sexual assault, and yet we find care in some of the most abstract ways, right? Like, I have seen people using heroin, and that's the way that they're caring for themselves. I've seen people in a K-hole 3 times a week as an escape method, but they are experiencing joy because outside of their life, they're not experiencing joy. Circuit parties are a whole other thing because they're bank members just going to party. But for general speaking, for almost 100 years in America, queer people have concentrated in bars. And, would you say that I know this sounds weird, but the bar scene is a form of Ubuntu, is a form of, connecting with queer elders, with queer futures, and just that being a space for care?
You know, I think it's helpful for me to talk a little bit about the queer origins of the book here as well, because this book came out because I was writing an NIH grant about queer people's mental health in Zimbabwe. So queer people in Zimbabwe had come to me as a community member and a mental health researcher because they were like, we need help. Trans people are dying. The laws are so repressive. Definitely one of the most homophobic countries in the world, and probably one of the hardest places to be queer. And they were like, what can we do? And my instinct as, you know, Western trained physician and like a mental health researcher was like, well, we gotta have a grant, right? Because that solves everything. So I started to write this multi-million-dollar research grant to study queer people's mental health in Zimbabwe because that felt like the right thing to do. And as I was writing this grant, my mentors at Harvard at the time kept pushing me in a direction to make this grant about HIV, to make this grant about sexual health. And queer people in Zimbabwe were like, the fuck is this? But this is not what we want. We want parties, we want safe spaces, we want to hang out with each other. You know, we want what the gay bar scene looks like in Washington, D.C., because, you know, there is some kind of joy that is happening there that they felt like they needed to unlock and they wanted to unlock. And so I stopped writing the grant and decided not to submit it. And then I had a lot of free time on my hands. And I was like, well, what do I do now? So I carried on talking to queer people in Zimbabwe, and they really helped me think through a lot of these ideas of what care could look like. Like mutual aid was an idea that I, had heard about and thought a little bit about, but had never really engaged in properly. And at some point I became involved in some of those mutual aid programs, and I became, almost a recipient of mutual aid, because what mutual aid is helping each other out while you're also working to change the world around you. And that's such a powerful framing for thinking about these things. And so I realized that what I was doing was not writing a book about queer people's mental health, but a book of queering mental health itself, of taking the concepts from the lived experiences of queer community members and of myself, of using a margin to center approach to rethink these things, of thinking about radical things and ways of caring for people like mutual aid, of destabilizing categories that we're so often put into. Those are ideas that queer people have been thinking about since the beginning of time. And so, queer theory became a way of approaching what I realized was a completely cis heteronormative space, psychiatry and medicine, and really helped me kind of rethink these things. And so, yes, I think the bar scene is a type of mental health care. Is it the healthiest? Sometimes, maybe not, but but often it is what we have, and we get so much joy out of it. And I think that is so powerful. And what I want is us to kind of depathologize those kinds of things too, and for people to understand that kind of socialization is extremely, extremely important to our mental health. And queer people say it in a way that is so unabashed, and I love that.
And a lot of times, there's a lot of drugs, and I think where is that line, about harm reduction and eradicating the carceral psychiatry movement, right? Like when we see people on drugs, we put them in jail. At the same time, we have to ensure that people aren't harming themselves or others. And so when queer people are higher users of drugs, where is that ethical line to ensure that people have autonomy and agency, but they're not harming themselves or others too at all?
Are you trolling me? Again, there's this probably the other question that keeps me awake at night. Is this question of autonomy. And that applies not just to drugs, but it applies to all mental health conditions and all types of kind of medical approaches. Is, well, when do we take someone's autonomy away from them? When they're, the go-to kind of line in the sand that a lot of people draw is when they're a harm to themselves or others. But that is the line for every psychiatric diagnosis, right? Like what makes a disorder is when it is causing harm in that person's life or in the lives of other people. The question is, who gets to decide that? And that's a question that I don't have a good answer to. And it's something that is deeply, deeply troubling to me. For me, that is a line that I still think is not quite the line. I am someone who, I'm like as much autonomy for the patient as possible. And so I like to think about autonomy giving mental health interventions, like the idea of soteria, which is an intervention for psychosis that was developed in the 1970s by a guy called Lauren Moshe. He was the head of schizophrenia at the NIMH, and he built these houses for folks experiencing acute psychosis where they could come, no involuntary treatment ever. You never take someone's autonomy away from them. Medications exist, but they are never forced on people. They have to choose to use them if they would like to use them, and they're minimized. Doctors try in those settings to minimize the use of those medications. And folks experiencing psychosis will live in a soteria house for a period of time where they engage in, shared activities, music, art, plays, gardening, and navigate their psychosis together through therapy, and through kind of like mutual love and care for each other without the autonomy stealing component that is part of so many mental health interventions in the medical field. And it works. The like randomized control trial for soteria show that it works just as well as other types of inpatient psychiatric, if not better in some trials. And so, when I think about autonomy as a physician, my goal is always the most autonomy possible for the patient. And if I were making those choices, that is what I would choose. Sometimes, though, in the particular settings in which I work, I don't have those kinds of choices. I was in the hospital a couple of weeks ago and had a patient who had schizophrenia and was in a state of acute psychosis or delirium and was literally banging his head and smashing his own head against the wall and hitting everything in sight, and was really, I couldn't stand to look at it. It was hurting me to watch him. And I couldn't change the situation. I couldn't take him to a soteria house. It was 2:00 in the morning. I was the doctor on call in the hospital. And I restrained him. I put him in physical restraints, and I gave him an antipsychotic Haldol to calm him down so that he would rest and sleep. And that was extremely hard for me to do. I find that really, really hard to do as a physician. But sometimes, because I'm working in a capitalist, healthcare system, and in that very specific circumstance, I have absolutely what feels like absolutely no choice. It feels like the most compassionate thing to do, and that was the decision that I could make. And I made it at that time, in conjunction with all the nurses and everyone else who also had a lot of experience working with patients. And I still feel conflicted about those decisions when I have to make them. But what I know is that I'm making that decision because the circumstances are the wrong circumstances. The structure in which I am working and trying to help that patient is not a caring structure. It is not that I am not caring or that we don't care for that patient. It's that the structure itself is not a caring structure.
So it's a structure that's a problem.
I do think it's a structure that's a problem. I just think that like hospitals, clinics, and like modern like healthcare facilities should not be the site for mental health care at all. I don't think we should be doing any of it in hospitals. I think all of it should be pretty much entirely outpatient, and that is not something that like is that far from reality. In Trieste, Italy, a place with 200,000 people, there in the 1970s had a complete revamping of the mental health system of the city, and they narrowed the number of mental health beds from 1,200 mental health beds to 36 overnight beds just for acute crises. and they don't use medications. They try to limit them as much as possible. This is in a whole city. They have really engaged crisis response where they go into people's homes and help them be cared for in their homes with their families. And they help people connect to work and meaningful employment. They create community centers where folks can go and play music and do art, just like the Soteria houses. There's so much like ancillary support for outpatient mental health care that all they ever have to have are these 36 beds that are often empty, which are there for very, very like acute cases for when we really, really need it. And I feel like we could be doing the same thing here if they can do it in Italy. Well, the interesting thing about this program in Italy is the psychiatrist who designed that whole system, Franco Basaglia, actually came to the US in the 1960s to learn how to do it. Because at one point, through JFK's Community Mental Health Act, we had those types of community mental health resources that got later gutted by Reagan in the 80s. And so we could have been the innovators on all of this stuff. And instead, an Italian psychiatrist came here and learned about it for 6 months and then took it back and reformed the Italian healthcare system.
Wow. So, I want to kind of go back to schizophrenia and really look at, there's a misconception that mental states are static, right? We think of a person as an essentialized person having an essentialized mental state, right? We think that people are always neurodiverse. When we think about autistic people, we don't think that there are like external factors that can change the way that neurofunctioning shows up. When it comes to schizophrenia, that is kind of where it becomes more problematized, right? We can see an individual can seem like neuronormative for the most part, and then some trigger happens, and then they either become a threat or they instill fear in people, like the instance that you were speaking of. So how can we eradicate the essentialized perspective of mental states, and how do we allow for that transient component to allow people to be more of water flowing through cognitive states?
I think the most important way is by elevating the voices of people with lived experience. So, when you actually talk to people with schizophrenia, you realize that they are not living in a state of constant florid psychosis. In fact, nothing could be further than the truth. People with schizophrenia, both on and off medications, all the time, participate in society, and ride the bus and like have children and go to law school and become doctors. Actually, the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, what we think of as psychosis, is a very limited portion of what that illness looks like for most people. There are also the negative symptoms of schizophrenia where you feel really apathetic and depressed, and then the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia where you have trouble thinking. And that is honestly where most folks with schizophrenia are living a lot of the time, in these kind of like more sort of apathetic and like struggling with like thinking states, rather than in these states where they are seen as a threat to others. And so I think the way of sort of allowing folks to see that is by basically letting people with lived experiences explain this to everyone. And in mental health research, this has been a really big issue because we decenter the actual patient in all of our research. And it couldn't be further from the truth of what's going on with them. And so, that's always what I'm interested in, is like, what does good mental health research look like? It looks like research that is designed by, that is run by, that is, by folks with mental illness, for folks with mental illness. So that's what I would like to see change.
Can you kind of speak about, you talk about in the text the racialized component of mental health, and how, in particular, people who have schizophrenia, if you are a Black male with schizophrenia, you're exponentially higher chance of being seen as a threat, right? Black men in general are just seen as a threat. Can you kind of tell how mental health kind of ties into that racialized component of who is a threat and who needs to be contained or detained?
this has been happening since the beginning of time, since the beginning of medicine and psychiatry. These pathologizing framings for behaviors that do not fit with the social norms of society, starting with drapetomania, this idea of diagnosis applied to Black slaves trying to escape captivity, they were seen as obviously mad because they wanted to escape conditions of oppression. And then protest psychosis, in the 1960s, the historian Jonathan Metzl shows how so many folks were labeled with protest psychosis, which is a delusional anti-whiteness after hearing the words of Malcolm X.
I like that.
And then today, right, Trump derangement syndrome, which is basically, pathologization of folks who oppose the rhetoric of Donald Trump. And so, those types of socio-political framings of mental illness and pathologizing of people who do not fit with society are always going to happen. And I think that that's what psychiatry misses. It keeps thinking that, well, that was then and now we're now. We're taking homosexuality out of the DSM. That happened in the 1970s. And when psychiatrists did that in 1973, they felt really good about themselves because they were like, well, now we're not biased anymore. We took that one bad thing out of the DSM. But the DSM continues to pathologize over and over, especially marginalized communities, queer people, people of color. And we see that even with the central diagnoses that we have, like schizophrenia, as you say, because Black men are way more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than white men. White men with similar symptoms who see the same clinicians would be more likely to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which is a more palatable diagnosis. And so, I think that that is something that psychiatrists reckon with, and that will always be a problem. I don't think that's going to go away. I don't think more iterations of the DSM are going to make it any fairer, because we'll just continue to apply all these other diagnoses that we come up with in ways that are racialized, in ways that marginalize people who don't fit with the norms of society.
I think we've been talking for so long, I forgot to do audience questions.
Yeah, we can do one or two.
You guys want a question to ask?
So, there's a couple of things that came up for me. I'm sorry, you can't hear me. Hi. I remember this time in grad school where we were a bunch of arts and cultural educators, and we were sharing our experiences about, I don't want to use the word traumatic, but just times that were hard for us, and how the readings and education that we were getting were not addressing this fundamental human part of us. And so we ended up having this sharing exercise where we thought it sounded a lot like your Zoom workshop. To be not facetious, but it sounded a lot like that, where we tried to open up the floor and talk about traumas. And it was a similar thing where afterwards we thought we did a good thing.
Yeah.
But it turned out that it opened up more wounds for people and left them feeling very much vulnerable, and where do we go next? We talked about these hard and traumatic things, but where do we go? So that happens a lot, where it's not necessarily trauma is not helpful to talk about in that kind of context. But one thing I keep hearing about from you, this through line of, it seems like going back to community, and also basic humanity that people need. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about how that shows up in the work, maybe throughout the world, what community looks like in places where maybe capitalism isn't the focus and people aren't in so much isolation, which I feel folks are still struggling to come out of after the pandemic. Because to me, it seems like capitalism kind of focuses and forces isolation in a lot of ways, from family, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Anthropologists think that, these 5 things really matter when it comes to the way mental health conditions are spread across the world and how severe they are. They are how madness is understood in society, whether the mad can work, how families are involved, the general social condition itself and the experience of illness itself. And there's two there that I want to talk about that are related to your question. The first is whether the MAD can work. In the US, an entry-level job in a capitalist system, even at McDonald's flipping burgers, that's a pretty high intensity thing, right? That's a high pressure job. If you have schizophrenia, that's not a job you can do. That kind of capitalist structure makes work really difficult for people, and it puts them outside of the economy. If you have schizophrenia in a rural part of India, you might be able to find work as an artisan or working in the fields. In that kind of more communal setting, there are spaces where you can integrate. In the US, we have nuclear dual income families where everyone leaves from 9 to 5 and goes off to work or school. If you don't go to work or school, who's going to care for you? But if you're in a rural village in India and you are living in a multi-generational family home, there are ways that you could be part of your society in a meaningful way that are not pathological, that are not like you wouldn't be thought of as necessarily ill. And so, when I think about, what this really means and like how it comes into play in terms of mental health care and treatment, I like to say that we are all really mental health care providers. And part of the problem with medicine is that it thinks of mental health care as only something that can be done by a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a licensed therapist. But really, what we're doing here right now, this is a form of mental health care, thinking about the politics of mental health care together and showing up to really think through these ideas and be here for each other. This is healing for me and it's important for me. And it's a reminder that mental health care is done, by bartenders who are serving drinks to folks who are going through difficult times, by sex workers, by teachers. Mental health care is everywhere. And the moment that we take it outside of the medical field and we start to engage with it as part and parcel of what we are all already doing, we give it that validation within our society that pushes us towards a pro-social idea of thinking through these things. And just a slight turn towards that pro-social way of thinking things. I'm not unrealistic. I don't think that we can suddenly, completely change the social cultural norms of America. But if we all leave today with just something a little bit more pro-social in mind, and we do that thing, we call our grandma, or we organize that protest that we've been thinking about working, or we do something in engaging with our social and political worlds because we've been made to think harder about those things, then I will have succeeded. If you leave this today and you just do one thing that might be more pro-social than you would have done without having had this conversation, that is the best that we can be doing. And so, these types of cultural changes, they're not switches that we can flick overnight, but if we don't have these conversations, then they're definitely not going to happen.
Anybody want to follow that?
Hi. So, I guess building on what I've seen in my own family, is the need to go to work or the need to go to school. It's kind of we don't have time for quote unquote therapy talk. And so I think at least in Asian America, the stigmatization of mental health and recovery becomes part and parcel of the mono-minority myth in some ways. And I wonder how that maps in spaces transnationally. So you talked about how there's trauma and recovery, but in a lot of spaces where there is chronic trauma, maybe where trauma is even the baseline, there's not a recovery time. So in your work, have you kind of seen that ever lead to maybe an inability, or I guess not having the space to recognize trauma or the stigmatization of mental health?
Can you tell me a bit more about your question? I think I understand where it's going, and I think it's important, but if you could just, give me one more example of kind of what you were sort of thinking about? Or like, what were you kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess, so you're talking about like COVID in Zimbabwe,
Sure.
and how it's not necessarily exceptional, it's just another course of
Another
life.
hit, yeah.
Right, another hit. And so in spaces where trauma is almost like the baseline, like it's just like, I go through one course and now it's time to go on to the next, and then the next, and then the next. Do you think that's related to maybe like the stigmatization of mental health care that we often see, at least in the United States and predominantly in like immigrant communities, for example?
Maybe, but I think it's more structural than that. I think that the problem is bigger than that, bigger than a non-recognition of what's going on. Because trauma and the way that we're thinking about mental health problems in the West are just one way of thinking about mental distress and the way that it affects people's minds and where it is coming from. So, there are different cultural explanations for and what anthropologists call explanatory models for thinking through where distress is coming from. And I was talking a little bit earlier about kufungisisa, thinking too much, which is a pretty common idiom that people in global South cultures use to describe their mental distress. And it doesn't borrow at all from the mental health vernacular that we're all familiar with, but it's still a recognition of the fact that you're experiencing distress itself. So I don't think that it's like a lack of awareness. And I think that this idea that like what we just have to do is make everyone aware of their like depression or their trauma or their mental health, I think that is a fallacy, because people are aware. They know when they are depressed, and they also have an idea of where that distress is coming from. So when I ask patients in Zimbabwe, well, what are you thinking too much about? Well, they'll tell me. They'll be like, I don't have enough money to pay rent this month. I don't have enough money to send my kid to school. I'm being beaten by my husband. They will tell you exactly what they are thinking too much about. But the problem with the psychiatric approach to these problems is that in psychiatry, when you make a diagnosis, the etiology, the source of the distress, is not part of a diagnosis. You can make the DSM and these diagnoses and the criteria for them say nothing about where the distress is coming from. So you can diagnose someone with depression or anxiety on symptoms alone. But a lot of the time, if you sit with a patient for long enough, they'll tell you, I broke up with my girlfriend, or whatever it is. They will know exactly why they're distressed. The problem is that we in the medical field don't have tools to help our patients with those problems. And so then we think of it as not important because we just have this little toolkit of therapy and medications. The truth is that we actually can work to change the social conditions of our patients that are creating mental illness in the first place. And in the book, I use this idea that I think it's a little bit of a hack, but this idea called social prescribing, which is the way that clinicians can write prescriptions for patients, sometimes physical prescriptions, for things in their lives that they need to survive and thrive. It could be housing. You can connect patients with housing through housing vouchers and through good housing policy. It could be a prescription for a dance class or for a community center. These are things that we need to be thinking about that have a bearing on the social determinants of our patients' mental illness. But we are so used to thinking about mental illness only through the framework of therapy and medications that our imagination is limited for what we can do.
Nice job. All right, let's give it up one more time. And we're gonna sign some books.
Thank you.
Will you sign mine too? Should we get a line of signers?
Yeah, if y'all want to start like going this way, and then I will clear out chairs. You know, so books for sale.
Tell the philosophy department.
I'm curious to hear his thoughts about being within the system, right? The tools, the language, and all this.
Where were you?
You're never going to get insurance to pay for a solution or a problem that you are in the system. That causes.